My word, having finished this, I've discovered there are a lot of books called Horns and Halos. This is Horns and Halos by Nina Rose. I'll link to the Amazon and Goodreads pages in the description for those of you who are interested, and without further ado, let's get into this review. So the little reading I do is mostly for self-development purposes. After all, if you want to expand your knowledge, what better way is there than reading a book on any subject you're so interested in? That said, I do on occasion read a fiction novel, though I tend to stick quite closely to the few authors I know, but on occasion I do see a book that piques my interest, and when available for the right price, I take the risk. This was one such book. I've got a thing about angels and demons, probably something to do with being taken to church all throughout my youth. So seeing a book named Horns and Halos, I was ready for some epic biblical fantasy steeped in nods to the existing canon, but that wasn't really what I got. Holding a 4-star rating on both Goodreads and Amazon, there must be something to it though, right? Well, with you the audience adequately hooked, let's start where we always do. To a description. Luckily, it's the same on both Amazon and Goodreads. My world is built on debts and deals. Beneath them all, you'll find horrific secrets that we all hide. Its lives, its souls, scattered and countless. The dead have built towns, cities, and nations. They are forever damned in the afterlife because they want to live without fear. But did they really live without fear, or was it all an illusion? A pact between devils is the only thing that keeps villagers out of the desert-like land untouched by the scourge of this planet. The world we once knew is destroyed, and what remains of those left behind trying to build homes and escape the reality that the end has already come. But are we any better than creatures that loom, roam, tear and destroy? Are we really worth saving? At the age of 19, I was chosen and cast out of my village as a sacrifice. Now I have no choice but to make a deal of my own or die out in the endless stretch of wastes. Needless to say, sounds like my kind of book. A dark world filled with pain and suffering, an ideal location for a budding hero to build his or her epic. And yet, it wasn't what I got. In fact, having read the book, I would like to start by striking the whole first paragraph. Hell, or its substitute, is not really mentioned at any point throughout the book. There's nothing beneath them. But are the dead, scattered in countless, in towns and cities and nations trying to live without fear? No. No, that they aren't, mainly because this is set in a post-rapture world. The characters within this world are very much living people who were left behind. Granted, this is in addition to devils and demons which now walk the earth, but the dead, no, you die. Just like in the real world, you enter the great unknown. Let's still give the benefit of the doubt. Sure, they're not technically dead, but it's a metaphorical sense maybe. They're still scattered and countless, right? No, not that either. They live in what is, for all intents and purposes, peace and comfort, in small isolated towns and one large town or city, but each town is separated and individual and there are no nations. I say all this not to nitpick, but to justify my expectations of what the book would be. The rest of the description is fairly accurate. It's a little less of a desert-like land and more of a wasteland. Each village has farms and there's a nice big flowing river, so hardly a barren desert, and the pacts are between humans and devils, not devils and devils. The pacts are made and the devils give protection to their villagers. Which finally brings me to the end of the description and to the actual book. Our protagonist, Sia, a 19-year-old girl, is chosen and cast out of her village, as it is agreed that in exchange for the protection of their village by their guardian devil, that they shall exile one randomly chosen 19 to 23-year-old each year. Framed as almost an exchange with the neighbouring villages, though it is in fact an open secret that this is a lie, and those exiled have a limited life expectancy in the wastes. She faces extreme dangers, forcing her to make an unknown deal with the devil for her safety as she makes her way towards the Faith City, where she may find her home. As far as I can see, what I've said so far is objectively true, but what comes next is opinion, and if it hasn't become obvious by now, it's a negative leaning review. But with one preface, I have nothing against the book or the author, it just wasn't for me. While I may hate it, you may love it. I suppose you'll have to stick around and make up your own mind. Now, starting with the most glaring of problems, that this is in no way a fantasy book, it is a romance book, to put it bluntly. Granted, in a borderline fantasy setting, but at its core it's all based in romance. I'm a guy, and to put it another way, just an everyday type bloke. I have little care for romantic arcs, gentle kisses and sophisticated poetic metaphors. Romance doesn't ruin a book, but I read through it quickly and try to get back to the story. Trouble is, here the romance is the story. The world, the characters, the development, I find them all lacking in one way or another, and being disinterested in what this book is actually trying to offer, the romance, I found little within with which to be enveloped in. But I know I wouldn't be satisfied with such a general statement, so let's get into my problems with the book. And don't worry, this is a relatively spoiler-free review, at least for the beginning, and I'll give adequate warning before going into any spoiler-heavy sections. So, let's start with the staples of biblical fiction, angels, demons and devils, which in this case is from the least to the most important, as angels for the most part are absent from this book, such that they are hardly worth consideration. Demons, however, are present in the form of three distinct creatures that are present throughout but firmly in the background for the most part. It is the devils with which this book really plays. And no small number, as at the top of my head I'm inclined to say there are about 7 who appear in total, each with a substantially important role. Yet I don't truly feel that I understand them. Sure, they make deals, and sure, they are the method of survival for human villages, but their motivations are unclear. Each of them is radically different from the last. We're told that having a pact with the devil was grounds to be treated like you were filth, even though essentially everyone is in some way linked to one. They have great power which they offer, almost on compulsion, but at a low individual price, and a juxtapose between their violent tendencies and what I would call a clear desire for order. They have hierarchies but don't seem to interact, and motives which they don't seem to pursue. They are, for the majority of people, essentially just gods. They give protection in exchange for following of basic and, in my estimation, good and fair terms. Which is about as much as I can say without spoilers. As for the demons, they are much more base. They burn in the light and hunt in the dark, attacking that which they come across in the wastes. While other types are mentioned in the book, only 3 appear: soldiers, leeches and grunts. Grunts are the weakest and most common, a demonic dog, a pack hunter who eat one of its own as happily as it would its prey. Leeches come next in a floating tentacle balls that exaggerate and feed off negative emotions. And lastly there are soldiers, intelligent humanoids who seek to kill and inflict pain. There's not much to say about demons as a whole. They're well classed out in catalogue and mostly plays a motivating factor to hurry between safe havens. Of course, that's just where things begin, and there's always a wider context, the world in which the story takes place. The post-apocalyptic world in which those that remain are subject to unending suffering, but not really. They struggle for survival, but not really. They live difficult lives, but not really. For the most part, they're safe, comfortable and want for nothing. It is about as far from apocalyptic as you can be. Even in comparison to our own world, it seems a fairly peaceful, pleasant place for the most part. The people all live in small villages or the city. They have access to water in the form of a river, which they build along. They have adequate food and supplies. Even that which you would imagine they'd lack, from meat to medicine. They live as you may have 200 years ago. Of course, there is an enemy beyond the walls, the demons, but they don't bother the villagers as they're protected. In fact, the only inconvenience is the terms put upon them by the devil which they have to deal with. Even when arriving at a place with running water is just a convenience to have, like a flushing toilet. You don't have to carry the water from the river to your house. Even modern luxuries like coffee is just accepted. The first village, Seer's village, as mentioned, has to exile one member per year. The second can only work so many hours a day, and the third have an obligatory party every night to keep their devil entertained. Horrific, I know. The outside world is not inviting, but not overly inhospitable to you. If you exclude the demons, as they're only active during the night, you're more or less safe during the day. Here's where another of my complaints lie. Although much of the book is spent travelling the world, it's not really explained. There's no reason why each village could not simply expand, lessening the cost of each deal, as it's spread over more people. Despite that, you'd imagine there'd be a lack of livestock, yet they seem to have plenty. They don't seem to lay traps or hunt demons for their meat or for any other reason. Everything is more or less presented as how it is, and isn't explained. For instance, in both the other villages, the devil is known as a chief type figure, who comes and goes as any other villager would for the most part. It is not addressed where the first village's devil is, and he simply doesn't show up, something I'll theorise a bit later on. Mind you, even what is presented seems quickly forgotten. Early in the book, the importance of a name is stressed, that there is much power in a name, and you shouldn't give it to anyone, especially someone who isn't worthy of trust. A point which all readers really should find intriguing. I wondered how this would factor into the story, the twists and turns it could take place. But no, this was simply forgotten. In fact, our main character is the only person to have such reservations. Everybody else introduces themselves as you would expect. No mind games, no subterfuge, no hesitation, and no power. But a book can be forgiven for lacking theological depth and world building just so long as the characters are compelling. Trouble is that the characters are what I feel are most lacking, for two main reasons. Primarily because each character seems to lack any history coming into existence as and when they're needed, and secondly, the incredibly short time over which this book spans. For all that happens and all the changes we're expected to accept take place over about only 2 weeks. What's more, characters go from exhausted and injured in one scene to happy and energetic in the next, despite no time passing. As though they simply forgot they could not take one more step, or were bleeding to death merely a few lines ago. This is not limited to just their physical states either, but emotional ones too. Characters, particularly at the beginning and the end, are either emotional or coldly rational depending on what seems to be required, and they switch between these two states, easily brushing past huge emotional events like losing your home as though it was nothing. This becomes necessary given the brief period over which the story takes place. Mere days are enough to form the deepest emotional connection or the firmest of beliefs. But it all comes down to a door falling from its hinges. In an abandoned village when they arrive, a door falls from its hinges in a gust of wind. For me, this just exemplified things. The door was fine up until they arrived, at which point it came into existence and the wind took it away. The character's mere presence is enough to set things into motion, even devoid of any action. Going back to the timeline though, which I noted while reading feels split into 2 parts at about the chapter 23 mark, at which point they reach their destination. And there's just a strong feeling of finality and change in the main character, when she finally starts acting like a human being. I just can't help but to think, if the book ended on their arrival to the Faith City, it would have given so much more time for the world and characters to be developed while still giving a complete story arc. If paired with the expansion of time over which the book is set, it would allow the story to slow down and for the changes in situation and status not to simply happen. So many of the notes that I made when reading this book were along the lines of, really? It's only been 4 days. Now, the development of the world and the characters is undoubtedly rushed. As soon as they come into contact with money, characters immediately accept the concept, without so much as a second thought, despite the fact they have no reason to accept or have faith in its holding its value. The villagers see her visits, welcome her with open arms, and lack any kind of wariness you'd expect given the infrequency and type of visitors that they would have received before. And yet, when shown in the city, it is presented as some great wrong, that you will not be welcomed with open arms, that the locals would watch or judge you, a stranger. It's not some great evil, but an unquestionable presumption that this should happen. Given the world in which this is set, any less than deep suspicion, even borderline hostility, is almost unthinkable. After all, where do the nomads come from? What had they done to be exiled from their homes, and why were they trying to enter yours? But I'm expected to accept that after only a few days, Elijah, our co-star if you will, is so attached to Sia that he would run into danger, even almost certain death for her. That after a disaster, people who have known her for a little more than a week would put their complete faith into her reorganising their entire society, or that she would accept a new and alien belief system completely without any reason to do so. Now, it's from this point that the spoilers start to come in. Nothing that will ruin the book should you wish to do so, but spoilers are spoilers all the same, so feel free to skip to the conclusion. Not that I'm going to timestamp it because I'm lazy. And I imagine you can take a good guess at where it's going. But now we're into the spoiler section, let us return to angels, demons and devils. If I have one big gripe here, it's with the nature of devils. Namely, that on one hand, deals with the devils appear to always be for the best, and the price is never paid by one who makes the deal. From the soul of your first love, the life of your father, or annual exile of one village member for a year, it never appears to be borne by the person making the deal. Even when offered the seller's soul on the occasion it happens, it is refused. Which may be fine on its own, maybe it's like a metaphor for selfish behaviour leading to other people's suffering. But those left behind after the rapture would have no reason not to make deals, as they're already all damned to hell. But as we find out, a devil cannot take a soul that belongs to heaven. The selling of another person's soul can only be done if they're already going to hell, and cannot be taken if they redeem themselves. As such, the selling of souls is null and void, as the wastes are devoid of faith or its teaching. You cannot simply reach the Faith City without extreme luck or the help of a devil. Your best option is to make a deal, or simply live with the deal that has already been made for your village, each of which are different. Even then, it's not necessarily a case of the best of bad options. As far as I can see, the so-called devils are more analogous to the Old Testament God than the traditional depiction of devils. They are truthful and fair, but firm in their response. Even the devil himself is held out to the common interpretation of deals and doesn't attempt to weasel his way out or bend the rules, something I'll come back to in a minute. Throughout the book, devils are portrayed as eminently reasonable. They exercise restraint, not simply attacking anyone and taking everything they want. If anything, their characters are more indicative of children when given some explanation. Wanting to see people indulge in pleasures and be happy, to avoid work or to cause minor mischief. Each child can be cruel and tantrum prone, but on the whole they're not evil or even necessarily bad. In the one case we see two devils together, When under threat, one goes to protect the other, seemingly with no regard for himself. Even in the climax, when the main devil we follow, Draki, his intentions are stated, it plainly comes off as unconvincing. If he merely sought to cause despair, there are better ways to do so, and every opportunity to do so. In comparison, angels come off as far more cold. Although we find out everybody is watched over by at least one, they never intervene and never make themselves known. There are no prophets sent to evangelize, or even vague pointers towards salvation. They, with one exception, ignore the strong and the weak, the evil and the righteous. They merely watch from a distance, content to watch and not intervene. A particularly amusing note I came back to after finishing the book that manages to encapsulate both my problems with the characters and cast doubt on the twists is this. As far as the devils go, they seem fairly normal, but the main character, Sia, is pretty much the incarnation of lust. She seemingly falls in love at first sight upon meeting Draki, the devil she makes a deal with, and Elijah, a young man in the next town over where she stops. And these love interests are sparked immediately after Sia meeting each character. Both romances constantly occupy her thoughts going forward, which is fine in principle, but given her clear disposition, it makes it a little unbelievable that she, or Elijah, would be devoid of romantic connection before they'd met each other. But both interests were clearly telegraphed and were no way a surprise when they grew, despite the book somewhat relying on the surprise of these feelings. As a whole, this book has two big twists, neither of which I'll ruin here, but the first of which I can say that I foresaw a fair bit before, as it was too clearly hinted, and the other surprise is not one that I really accept, which I'll explain in my big spoiler section. But before I get to that, it's theory time. So, although he introduced himself as Draki, he is in fact the devil. I assumed, as I imagine many others would, that it was simply short for Dracula until it was hinted towards his true identity. But that's not to say he wasn't Dracula too, as it is hinted that he may have had some emotional relationship with a human. Considering the settlements, we see the three villages have protection deals with devils, and the city is protected through prayer. But in both of the two villages, devils are present and known to the villagers. It is only in the first that he or she is entirely absent, or are they? If the devil was not there, the village would lose its protection. Yet why would it not want to be around to revel in the exile that it's commanded, or to enjoy the village it is formed and controls? Maybe it was there all along, and maybe everybody knows it. When Draki first appears, even in his invisible form, Sia still senses him watching her. Despite this fact, his invisibility is shown to be effective throughout the book, bar with a blind woman who senses him, and other devils who interact with him all the same. What's more, when receiving religious instruction after reaching the city, her instructor speaks a strange language, presumably tongues, and Sia has an adverse reaction and is unable to understand or recall anything that was said. This is put down to her exhaustion, and Draki hints it may be because of their deal. Finally, there is the coincidence that when she is exiled, she comes into contact with a high-ranking devil. Now, here's the theory. Sia is part devil. The reason the devil appeared absent from the first village is that it is one of her family members and everyone else knows it. Her mixed heritage allows her to sense Draki, something that even surprises him, and explains her inability to understand the words of God. It even makes her meeting with Draki and his interest in her more logical, as he seemingly has little interest in anybody else. Which brings me towards the major spoilers and the end of this little review. All that's left is for me to explain my problems with the biggest twist and do a few little nitpicks before concluding. If you think you have any interest in reading this book, I do suggest that you skip over this section as it will contain major spoilers. So, the major twist in this book is the deal that Sia made with the devil. The deal was that in exchange for offering her protection and acting in her best interest until she found a new home, she would offer the soul of her first love. Now that is the big reveal, but the twist was that her first love was Draki himself. It is explained that Sia willed and reasoned herself into loving Draki. Now for obvious reasons I hate this outcome, as she would have been in love before given how inclined she is to fall in love. Secondly, I don't accept that you can force yourself into loving someone. And thirdly, Draki can simply twist the arrangement such that a romantic love becomes familial love and kill the mother. Even failing all of this, all he gains is his own soul, at which point he can use his power and simply kill everyone, because at that point his protection will have ended. Given the dynamics throughout this book, this would have been the clear outcome had the deal with conditions not been omitted. It is so hard to believe that Draki would not have seen it coming. Even if he did, I struggle to accept that you can sell someone else's soul, something I touched upon earlier. But even ignoring these factors, it gets worse when Draki tries to take revenge and goes all killy killy. He is told he can't, as it would breach the unfinished deal for the protection of the village, which is just stupid. If the deal was not made, there could be nothing to stop him. It is not as though he was bound to protect her as soon as the first deal was conceived in Sia's head. Both sides have to agree, and even then, if he could not attack the village, he could still attack her home and her family. But despite their absence from this book, an angel then suddenly appears to protect her and slay Draki, sending him back to hell, which makes no sense. As if they protected the righteous, why not help the other righteous characters in this book? How would Draki have claimed Elijah's righteous soul if the deal had gone through as he thought it would? It invalidates the book because it invalidates the deal on which it's based. Then, for no reason, the angel decides that he will be the protector of the village. But then why was there no angel watching over the Faith City when it was founded? Needless to say, I'm not a fan of this twist, and it was right at the end of the book, so it left me with a bitter taste in my mouth. Now, to do the same to you, let me do some nitpicking before I conclude, for which I have a whole page of notes. So, into the nitpicking. There's an unclear timeline. We're told that 100 years ago, people used to talk about how they'd seen the apocalypse coming. Yet later, we're told that the third village was founded when a deal was struck 147 years ago, which would have been before the apocalypse. There is a chapter in which perspective is switched, chapter 19, and it's presented from Elijah's perspective, and I simply hate changes in perspective. That's the full nitpick there. And despite being 19, Sia calls her family Mama, Daddy and Mima, which is just childish and out of place in a post-apocalyptic world. The fact that almost every named devil and angel is an existing character, from Cain in Midas to Abaddon, even though there is no reason for everyone they come across to be a major player. Given the safety and security of the first village, they would definitely have given the exiled person some form of protection past a machete. Say some basic leather armour, even if it was only to settle their own consciences. The initial reference to lockdowns, as in COVID lockdowns before the apocalypse, as one of the main reasons people knew random trades like blacksmithing, which is hard to believe is not exactly a easy do-it-yourself at home hobby. The fact that they are worried in the wastes at night with a lack of shelter, even though the demons need shelter to survive the day, which is to say no shelter should mean no demons. A big spoiler here, the fact that she makes a deal with Draki, who is Lucifer, and her protecting angel is Michael, presumably Archangel Michael, which is just needlessly grand on both ends. In the end of this book, she broke her village's deal before securing her own village, and was more than willing to be responsible for endangering absolutely everyone she'd ever known up until the point she left 2 weeks prior, for absolutely no reason. And finally, the fact that after leading to the destruction of the Faith City, the one glowing beacon of hope in the entire world which we're presented, all the survivors just eagerly trust her and submit to her rule, letting her order the whole society and build up as she so wishes, elevating people to positions they definitely have not earned. Which brings me to the final section of my review, the conclusion. So if you're looking for a romance story in a vaguely apocalyptic biblical fantasy world, and not too concerned about thrills like world building or character development, you may enjoy this. To be perfectly honest, I quite liked it up until the very end, though it certainly had more than a few problems. So 1.5 out of 5, 3 out of 10, however you like it, unless you feel like leaving out the last 30 pages and stopping after the first paragraph on chapter 31, page 330, which, while a bit of a cliffhanger, elevates this book to a solid 2.5 out of 5 or 5 out of 10. I suppose that's an unrealistic ask, even had I known watching the end of Samurai Champloo would ruin a perfect ending. I wouldn't have been able to help myself from finishing it, wanting to know what came next. And on that note, let me bring this review to a close. So I've been Alexander, and this has been Horns and Halos, a hit or a miss. And until next time, like, comment, subscribe, you know.